All right, so it's 12:01, so we're going to get started. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on the topic of specialty diagnostics for the human metabolome. The Metabolomix Plus test is an extensive combination of biomarkers that provides insight into some of the most important biochemical pathways of the human metabolome. Energy production, dysbiosis, neurotransmitters, metabolism, fatty acids, amino acid metabolism, oxidative stress, nutrient elements, toxic elements, and detoxification. This presentation will provide an overview of the Metabolomix Plus profile and a brief case description. Before we get started, I just wanted to address a couple of housekeeping issues to ensure you get the most out of this webinar. If you have any questions during the presentation, please enter them in the Q&A function at the bottom right-hand side of your screen. We will have a question and answer period at the end of the presentation and try to address as many questions as time permits. And if we don't get to your question, we will also follow up at the end of the webinar. With that, I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Warren Brown, naturopathic doctor. Dr. Brown earned his undergraduate degree at Kennesaw State University and his doctorate degree at the School of Naturopathic Medicine at Vassar University in Seattle, Washington. He went on to complete a CNME accredited residency program in the areas of naturopathic primary care and family medicine at the Holistic Health Clinic in Tacoma, Washington. During his residency, he worked alongside several leaders in the field of naturopathic medicine. Dr. Brown is board certified by the North American Board of Naturopathic Examiners. He is a member of the Arizona Naturopathic Medical Association and American College of Sports Medicine. Dr. Brown is one of Genova's expert medical educators and maintains a private practice in Scottsdale, Arizona. So Dr. Brown, over to you.
Thank you, Saroma. Can you hear me okay? Is my audio coming in?
Yes, you are.
All right, great. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Our presentation is Specialty Diagnostics for the Human Metabolome. We will be, there's my slide there. Are you seeing me in the camera as well, Saroma? I'll go ahead and turn that off if you can. Just wanted to say hello to everybody to start off with here.
Yes, I can see you nice and clearly.
Okay. All right, great. Well, I'll turn the camera off. I might pop back on at the end, but let's see here. There we go. All right, so let's get started. We're focusing on the Metabolomix Plus profile today. Our objectives are to give you an overview of the Metabolomix profile, explain how we arrive at the nutrient recommendations in the profile. We'll take a look at every page in the full report with all of the optional add-ons, which is over 160 biomarkers. So we'll try to cover everything here, at least in a broad overview. We'll discuss some interpretation and some application. I'll answer your questions at the end, and then I'll also integrate as we go through the presentation. I'll integrate some of the most frequently asked questions that I hear from clinicians. So what is the Metabolomix Plus profile? This is an extensive collection of biomarkers, and by looking at such a broad collection of biomarkers, we get some information about energy production pathways. We have some dysbiosis markers in the test, neurotransmitter metabolites as part of the test. You can add on fatty acids, amino acids, oxidative stress markers, nutrient and toxic elements, and markers that give us some insight into detoxification pathways. So this is done from a first morning void urine collection. And if you want the fatty acids, you'll need the bloodspot collection as well. And the genomic add-ons, which are available for the test, require a buccal swab. So the patient can collect this entirely at home. So one of the big benefits of this test. These are what's measured in the Metabolomix. The markers on the left side of the page there show us that we're measuring organic acids, we're measuring amino acids, oxidative stress markers. That's included in the Metabolomix Plus. The optional add-ons are bloodspot fatty acids, nutrient and toxic elements in the urine, and genomics, 4 genomic SNPs that you have the option to add on to this profile. Here are some common reasons why you might consider the Metabolomix Plus. This is not an all-encompassing list here, but these are some of the most popular reasons why clinicians order this test. It provides some insight into some of the underlying causes around these clinical conditions, such as fatigue, chronic stress, chronic inflammation, mitochondrial dysfunction, and mood disorders. But you might also order this test if you want more insight into which nutrients the patients are lacking due to a poor diet, or if they have a stronger need for nutrients based on utilization, such as sports fitness, or for instance, if they're on a medication that's creating a higher need for a particular nutrient, or if they have some kind of surgical history or special diets. So lots of different reasons why you might consider looking at the Metabolomix Plus profile. I think this is an important concept to keep in mind with the Metabolomix. So some of the markers that we look at are direct measured. So for instance, and looking at the upper left here, we see docosahexaenoic acid, which is DHA, one of the fatty acids that's measured directly if you order the blood spot along with the Metabolomix here. And it's something we can measure directly, and if we see a low level, we would think about correcting that with more fish in the diet, maybe a fish oil, something along those lines. So it's measured directly. It's pretty easy to see if it's low or not. The other concept that's important to keep in mind is that some of these things that we look at in the Metabolomix profile are more from a functional perspective. An example of that is we don't measure B12 directly, but we do measure methylmalonic acid, which is a metabolite that builds up when we lack B12. And looking at it from a functional perspective here with this graphic on the right side here, we see that in a given metabolic pathway, you have A converting to B, converting to C. And that's driven by enzymes, enzyme 1 and enzyme 2. And if there's a cofactor missing, in this case, an important cofactor for enzyme 2, such as B12, then you would see an accumulation of the B metabolite, which would show up in the urine or in some cases in the blood in high amounts, such as methylmalonic acid. So it's a functional perspective here. The Metabolomix incorporates both direct and functional assessments. So it gives you a more complete picture of nutrient needs for the patient. Let's take a look at an overview of the Metabolomix report here. 17 pages if you order the entire Metabolomix Plus with the blood spot fatty acids and with the optional genomics. And the first 6 pages will be something called an interpretation at a glance. That will be followed by some pathway and biomarker pages, and then the optional fatty acids, optional nutrient and or toxic elements, and the optional genomics after that. This is what the first and second page of the report looks like. The page on the left, very first page of the report, sorts out the nutrient needs according to high, borderline, and normal need. The second page, which is the page you're seeing on the right, is the suggested supplement schedule, which includes the patient's recommendations that are color-coded there in the middle column. We also include a third column on the right side of page 2 where you can feel free to make some adjustments to our nutrient recommendations. We make these recommendations based on biomarkers and pathways, which is very helpful. But if you have a patient with a special diet or a special clinical condition, you might need to adjust those upwards or downwards as you see fit, and you have the freedom to do so in this test. That column on the right is designated just for you. That's followed by page 3, 4, and 5, which are great teaching tools to use with your patients. As you go through the test results with them, you see that you have some talking points about each nutrient that we make a recommendation for. On the next slide here, I'll show you how this is set up for B6, for instance, where the X marks the spot where the nutrient need is. And again, that's based on the biomarkers in the report, which we'll take a look at in a moment. But this interpretation at a glance here is set up with 4 bullet points underneath each nutrient recommendation, and it covers the function of the nutrient, common causes of deficiency, complications of deficiency, and food sources for each nutrient. So we're always trying to get our patients to eat better, and you have the option to advise your patient to say, let's focus on foods for this particular nutrient. And you can use that as a tool if you like. Of course, you can always supplement with nutrients, but you have these tools here in the interpretation at a glance pages, which can be very helpful for crafting an effective treatment plan. The 6th page of the interpretation at a glance features some calculations that we make by looking at the pathways. We get a little bit of insight into potential mitochondrial dysfunction, need for methylation, and toxic exposure. And how we come up with the mitochondrial dysfunction calculation is we look at Krebs cycle markers, which we'll take a look at in a moment. But if we see imbalances in the Krebs cycle markers, it might mean that it's more difficult for the patient to make ATP, and that could be a sign of mitochondrial dysfunction. We look at need for methylation here. Of course, you will get more detail about methylation by the methylation profile that Genova offers, but this is it's a pretty good tool for getting a sense of need for methylation support here. It's I think a good start. And again, the more detail you could get in something like a methylation panel from Genova. Toxic exposure is also calculated here, and this is based largely on the toxin and detoxification markers from page 8 of the report. This would be the 7th page of the report here, where we plot out the Krebs cycle and we look at these analytes here. What we're looking for are buildups or blockages in a pathway. So in this case, if we look at malic acid, which would be at the 10 o'clock position on the cycle, we see that it's shifted a little bit to the right, indicating a high normal finding there. Sometimes that can be due to a lack of B3, which is a required cofactor to convert malic acid into its next step. And so that green circle mentioned just above and to the right of malic acid mentions B3. I'm sorry if it's not coming through clearly on the screen, but that is listed on the report to help you remember that B3 is a required cofactor to convert malic acid. And these are the kinds of things that are taken into account by our algorithm that helps generate the nutrient recommendations earlier on in the report. One other side note here is that there can be toxic elements that can make it more difficult for the enzymes in the mitochondria to make these conversions. And those would be listed in the red circles as inhibitors. And the green and red circles don't change. They are the same on every report. They're there just to remind us of the things that are required to convert from one step to the next, and the things that can inhibit conversion. So that's listed for you on this Krebs cycle page here. The next 10 slides, we are going to go through each section, and I've included some notes here on the right in the blue boxes there. You don't have to remember all of this. This is in our interpretation resources for the tests, our metabolic analysis profile guide, and our a Metabolomix NutriVal support guide. So just included a few notes here. What we look at here on this page would be in the upper left where we see the malabsorption and the dysbiosis markers. The two at the top left would be indolacetic and phenylacetic, which are markers that indicate bacterial fermentation of tryptophan and phenylalanine. And when you see those elevated, it could be a sign that the patient might need some digestive support. Could also be that if the patient has SIBO, they might be able to ferment those amino acids in the small intestine. So there's some things to think about, enzymes or a possible SIBO, but SIBO breath test would give you some more data there. The bacterial and yeast markers, which are also in this upper left section of this page, are byproducts of bacterial metabolism. So you'll see things like benzoic acid and DHPPA. And when those markers are elevated, it could be a sign that there's some dysbiosis. And of course, if your patient is talking about symptoms, gut symptoms, then that could be very likely. However, there is one other circumstance to consider, and that's in a patient who has a very healthy diet and no gut symptoms. You could potentially see some elevations in the bacterial and the yeast markers. So it's something to keep in mind if you're seeing some activity in those malabsorption and dysbiosis markers and the patient is doing okay with digestive function. It's always helpful to look for trends. There's a note here at the bottom right of this slide. We always want to look for trends, overall trends, rather than individual markers. It's often more helpful to do that. And of course, we can't lose sight of clinical history as part of the decision-making process. The neurotransmitter metabolites are in the upper right of this page. These are end products of neurotransmitter metabolism, and they can potentially build up due to unmet nutrient cofactor needs. These are largely dependent upon B vitamins, magnesium, manganese, maybe even zinc. So if we see elevations there, those are things to think about. There are some medications that can cause elevations. For instance, if a patient is on an antidepressant, you might see an elevation in 5-hydroxyindolacetic acid in this section, and that is fairly normal. The vitamin markers on this page, these are on the right side of the page. If you're seeing elevations for these, you will likely see strong or moderate to strong recommendations for B vitamins in the earlier pages in the report. And it's because these markers here are informing, in part, those recommendations earlier on in the report for B vitamins. And you'll see methylmalonic acid in this section. You'll see formoaminoglutamic acid, glutaric acid, alpha keto acids as well, and those all indicate a need for a particular B vitamin, and that's taken into account with our nutrient recommendations. On the lower right side of this page, you'll see toxin and detox markers. These, for instance, there's a styrene metabolite, which could indicate that the patient has some exposure to styrene. There is a metabolite of MTBE, which is a common gasoline additive and a water contaminant. At least here in the States, it's not used any longer in gasoline, but it has a long half-life in the environment and has commonly contaminated water supplies. So you can see those metabolites there. And then you'll see orotic and pyroglutamic acid. And if there are elevations for those, one thing to think about would be supporting detox pathways through B vitamins, maybe amino acids, magnesium, things like that. Tyrosine metabolism markers are all the way at the bottom right. There's a little bit of data on these being associated with connective tissue disorders, kidney issues, et cetera. Phenylketonuria. For what it's worth, I do tend to see these a little bit higher when the vitamin markers are elevated, indicating B vitamin needs, but most of the data there is what you see on the screen. There's more information in our support materials as well. The essential and non-essential amino acids are in the following page. We're on to page 9 now, and they're listed on the left side of the page. And we like to see those essential amino acids close to the middle part of the green reference range, ideally for the non-essentials as well. If you're seeing low amino acids, it could be a patient who's not getting enough protein in the diet. If you're seeing low amino acids with somebody who's reporting gut symptoms and elevation in the peptide markers at the lower right, that could be somebody who's not digesting their protein very well. So just some general considerations here, but a good result for the essential and for the non-essential amino acids is sort of right down the middle of the page of the green part of the reference range, that is. I like this page too because you can see, for instance, if a patient has low glutathione levels, we can look to this page and we can look at some of the building blocks for glutathione, like glutamine, which is in the lower left. We can look at N-acetylcysteine or cysteine rather. I always think about N-acetylcysteine if I see the cysteine levels low in somebody who has low glutathione. And you can see glycine on the right side of the page. So really nice page to get some insight into these essential and non-essential amino acids. And we have to get the essential amino acids through diet or through supplementation. The intermediary metabolites are at the upper right of this page. These are involved in amino acid metabolism. They're B vitamin dependent, so we give them that heading of B vitamin markers. Of course, keep in mind, they're not the only markers we're looking at to determine the need for B vitamins, but they do help inform the need. Urea cycle markers, these usually follow the trend in the essential amino acids, and from what I've seen and looking at reports over the years, but there are some B vitamin cofactors and magnesium cofactors that are important in the urea cycle. So that could be something to keep in mind if you're seeing a wide variance between these urea cycle markers, meaning some very low, some very high. Often that could be due to unmet needs for B vitamins or magnesium. The glycine serine metabolites here, again, we're still on the amino acids page here, but these are important markers because they are, for instance, glycine not only is a building block for glutathione, it has inhibitory neurotransmitter properties. It can convert to serine. These are important aspects of amino acid metabolism. These also are B vitamin dependent, magnesium dependent, as much of amino acid metabolism is. And so we look at them to help determine needs. One of the reasons why we look at so many different pathways to come up with a nutrient recommendation is that's a systems biology approach. And if we see themes for nutrients echoing throughout the report, it makes a more reliable recommendation. So there is some redundancy in the test here, and the organic acids and the amino acids, as we're looking at here, are indicators of that. Here's a note on the peptide-related markers, and I briefly touched on this a moment ago, but these are intermediary products between the crude protein that comes in through the diet and the amino acids that we ultimately break it down to fully utilize. And so if you're seeing elevations in the peptide-related markers, and let's say hypothetically you were seeing low essential amino acids, that could be somebody who's not digesting their protein very well. And it prompts the recommendation for pancreatic enzymes back on page 2 of the report. So it's something to keep in mind, but generally if you're seeing elevations in peptide-related markers, it's either due to a very high protein intake or somebody who's not digesting their protein very well. And stool testing would give you a little bit more data on that. For instance, the GIFX comprehensive. You could see pancreatic elastase, a little more direct way of looking at enzyme output. But often, if you've got somebody with who's reporting fullness after meals. You're seeing low amino acids and high peptide markers. That really builds a case for thinking about digestive enzyme support. The oxidative stress markers are on page 10 of the report. This includes lipid peroxides, which is oxidative damage to cell membranes, particularly the fatty acids in the cell membranes. And it includes 8-OHDG, which is evidence of oxidative damage to DNA. And there is a lot of literature on those two markers. And if you see elevations, we would think about trying to avoid oxidative stressors, whether that's a toxin or something that's uncontrolled blood sugar, for instance, something that's creating a free radical somewhere. So trying to figure out where that's coming from, and then also thinking about how do we make sure that the patient has enough antioxidant capacity to deal with that. And these two markers are really helpful for giving us some insight into how well the patient is getting the balance of oxidative stressors to antioxidant support. Also, too, if we see elevations in oxidative stress markers, that's something that informs our recommendations for antioxidants back on the first page. Since we're not measuring vitamin A, vitamin E, alpha lipoic acid, it's not something we measure directly. We look for evidence of oxidative stress, and we think about antioxidant capacity overall. And those things are what helps make the antioxidant recommendation. The add-ons, the optional add-ons. So you have to order these at the time of the test. You can't add them on later, but I find them really helpful. So this is something that makes sense to me to do just right off the bat. The reason why is because you can see the omega-3s, the 6s, and the 9s, and very quickly you can get a sense of the balance between those by looking at the percentage at the bottom of each category. So you compare the omega-3% to the omega-6% to the omega-9%, and just in a quick glance you can get a sense of, is this patient getting too many omega-6s, which are pro-inflammatory? Or do they have enough omega-3s to have enough anti-inflammatory activity? If you're prescribing fish oil or flax oil, or if you're prescribing GLA, for instance, you can see all of those measured directly here, and it's a really nice tool to have. The saturated fats and monounsaturated fats are also reported here, and I usually try to compare those two because generally the monounsaturated are preferred because most of the time our patients eating modern diets are a little bit higher in the saturated fats than the monounsaturated fats. So you can, again, here you can get a pretty quick sense of saturated fat status by looking at the percentage of saturated fats at the bottom of that category. And you can see if they're not getting enough, or because maybe they're avoiding fats on a low-fat diet, or maybe they're overdoing it with saturated fat. And there are also some sources for each of these different types of fats listed on the report. So it's an easy reminder of where those fats could potentially be coming from in the diet. The cardiovascular risk section here is at the bottom right of this page as well, and we see the omega-3 index is reported here, and most of the medical literature, the published medical literature on the omega-3 index, says that if we're above 8, it's cardioprotective. If we're between 4 and 8, it's intermediate risk, and if we're below 4, it indicates a higher cardiovascular risk. So it is a cardiovascular risk marker that can be helpful in assessing the patient's overall cardiovascular risk. The essential fatty acid metabolism is drawn out for you here on the 12th page. And I like this page because you can see the enzymes that make these conversions between each fatty acid. They're listed in the middle along with the nutrient cofactors that assist in making the conversions from one step to the next. So it's a really great tool to have, because often if you're seeing a patient who has a lot of B vitamin need, you might see some imbalances here on the page, because a lot of these conversions here are dependent upon B vitamins as well. You have the option to order toxic elements which comes along with sulfur, or you can order toxic and nutrient elements. So this is where you have the option to select either here. When you order the toxic elements, this is what the page looks like. If you add on the optional toxic and nutrient elements, this is what the page looks like. This includes 20 toxic elements, 15 nutrient elements, and the thing to remember about toxic elements and nutrient elements is that when you look at them in urine, as we're doing here in the Metabolomix Plus, it is a pretty short window of exposure. So there may be an outlier or two here and there, but keep in mind it's about 48 hours. Probably not any more than that in terms of the exposure window that you're looking at for the patient. So can be helpful to keep in mind. And there's a good screen to see, well, is there anything that's reaching that bright red part of the reference range there for the toxic elements? That would be the TMPL range, which would be, sort of a red flag for a particular toxic element. So helpful tool to have, especially if you've got a patient with some occupational history, or maybe a current occupational history, that is, for working with metals, or has maybe hobbyist activities where they're working with metals, things like that. Here are the genomic add-ons here. This would include, for instance, we'll start off with ApoE. The patient result is on the left side of the page, and in this case, just sample patient here, we're seeing this patient has a 2-4 genotype for ApoE. So one copy comes from mother, one copy comes from father. Most folks will fall into the 3-3 genotype. That does seem to be the most common genotype, which is intermediate risk for cardiovascular issues. In this case, this is not a very common finding here, a 2-4, but generally speaking, when somebody has an ApoE2 variant, they have to be a little more careful about carbohydrates, because large amounts of carbohydrates could trigger a stronger triglyceride response. Folks with an ApoE4 genotype for one or both copies, they tend to have more trouble metabolizing saturated fats, so they have to be more careful about saturated fat intake. And so in this particular case, where you've got a 2 and a 4, you're basically trying to guide this patient towards more common sense, well-balanced type of diet generally. If we're making a decision just based on ApoE, which I think has its limitations, I think avoiding either extremes in the diet could potentially be helpful. Of course, this is just the genotype, so you could flip back to the saturated fatty acid section earlier, and if they have an ApoE4 genotype, I always flip back to that section. And if we're seeing high saturated fats, then I'm typically talking to that patient about trying to make better choices around healthier fats. So ApoE can sort of help you make that distinction about how well they're potentially metabolizing fats and regulating cholesterol. MTHFR is one you can also add on. We look at 2 different locations. So you'll see in the upper left that there's a 677 location and a 1298 location. And at each location, we're looking at both copies of the gene. And in this particular case, there's a wild type for 677, meaning there's no SNP there. A green minus sign means there's no SNP. And we also see that for this patient, the 1298 is SNP'd on both copies. The red plus indicates a SNP. The arrow pointing down reminds us that this enzyme is downregulated when it's SNPed, so it's functioning slower. And this is an important enzyme for facilitating the formation of methyl tetrahydrofolate, and it's part of methylation. So folks who have this SNP, generally, we consider things like B12 and folate, and this is part of the methylation. It's involved in methylation, and of course we would look back to methylmalonic acid and formoaminoglutamic acid back in the Metabolomix organic acid section of the report. And then we can sort of put the pieces of the puzzle together and ultimately make a good decision for how to support the patient. COMT is also an option. This is another type of methylation. I think of MTHFR methylation as more of a cardiovascular type of methylation, generally speaking. Generally speaking, COMT is more of a detoxification type of methylation. And this involves metabolizing estrogens, environmental toxins, and catecholamines. So if in this case, we're looking at a result here where the patient is heterozygous, and this means that that enzyme is functioning a little slower. So they could have potential for things like catecholamines to build up, which might result in anxiety. They might not be detoxifying their estrogens or methylating their estrogens very well to detoxify those. And so sometimes it can be helpful to look at estrogen metabolism in that scenario. And then, of course, COMT is also part of this second phase of liver detoxification, where we eliminate environmental toxins. So has a lot of associations in the literature, and we summarize this in the commentary in the report. So anytime you see the commentary within the genomics that you add on to this, it is specific to that patient genomic result, that particular genomic result. So you'll see a lot of these things mentioned in the commentary, and we just scan through what we see in published medical literature and sort of integrate that into the commentary to help make it easier for you. The fourth and final SNP that you can add on to the Metabolomix Plus is TNF-alpha. This is a pro-inflammatory cytokine, comes from macrophages. And unlike COMT and MTHFR, if you have a SNP for TNF-alpha, that pathway or this particular enzyme is upregulated. So they're making an enzyme that's more active. So that could trigger increased inflammatory cytokine production. And when somebody has a SNP for this, the antioxidant recommendations in the Metabolomix Plus, you'll often see, not always, but often see that there are higher needs there. And it's because this increased production of inflammatory cytokines can create more oxidative stress. And so you can often see connections between these genomic results and the phenotypic results within the Metabolomix. So you're really kind of getting that sense of both genotypic and phenotypic data to help make decisions. And of course, when you add on the genomics for a patient, you only have to do that once. So that is, those genomics won't change. But it's nice being able to have the Metabolomix to pair this genotypic data with phenotypic data. Helps us make better decisions about how to support the patient. I have a comparison here between the Metabolomix Plus and the NutrEval, and Dr. Goldman will, from Genova, Stephen Goldman, he's one of our medical educators as well, and I believe he'll be talking to you about the NutrEval in the coming weeks. But I just wanted to offer this comparison. I think he'll probably throw up this slide as well in his presentation, but a lot of similarities between the NutrEval and the Metabolomix Plus. The biggest difference are glutathione and CoQ10, which are not part of the Metabolomix profile. And of course, vitamin D is an option on the NutrVal, but it's not on the Metabolomix. So those are the main three differences between both profiles. Additional educational resources, we have some on our website, gdx.net, including the MAP support guide, the NutrVal interpretive guide. We have Learn GDX educational modules on our website and live GDX webinars on our website as well. And the Lab Report podcast is a wonderful tool to learn more about Genova testing, hear from leaders in functional medicine and integrative medicine. And Dr. Devers and Dr. Chapman are the hosts of the podcast, and it's a wonderful tool. They're also entertaining, very entertaining to listen to as well. So it's a good way to get some entertainment and learn something at the same time. And then we have medical education phone consults available to our clients. So that does it for my presentation. I hope I've given you a quick overview of the profile and given you a couple things to look for in the Metabolomix Plus. I am ready and willing to answer any questions if you have them. So I will turn it back over to Saroma.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Brown. Just a reminder to everyone, if you can please type in your questions in the Q&A field. We will read out your questions and we can answer them for you. So while anyone's doing that, I thought I have a couple questions for you, if you don't mind, Dr. Brown. So what do you typically do with your patients and retesting? So when would you advise running this test again?
Good question. 6 to 12 months is a good time to check back in on things. I find that gives the patient enough time to implement some of the dietary changes that I talked to them about based on the test, and gives them a chance to get back in a routine, incorporate those dietary changes, and then we can see how they're looking at a follow-up test.
All right.
Somewhere between. And of course, the genomics, you only need to run one time. Got
it. And just a reminder to everyone that's listening, and Dr. Brown, you may not have been aware, but in Ontario, we do not have the genomics add-on currently available as an option. It's also a bit of a restriction within the college here for Ontario NDs. They can't order DNA-based testing, so that is not an add-on currently. And I do have a question here from an ND. It's okay. It's okay. It's hard to keep track. So here's a question for you. Any possibility of getting the slides emailed? I believe we will be able to do that, Dr. Bears. And I'm waiting for other questions. I actually have another one as well. We do currently have the option of ordering Metabolomix Plus or ordering metabolic analysis profile, or just ordering amino acids profile. So when would you opt, if at all, to order just amino acids or just organic acids as opposed to the entire panel?
I think those are good ways to get information about follow-up. So if I'm just seeing that the patient's amino acids are low, in the Metabolomix Plus, if I start with that one, and everything else looked pretty good, then I'll think about maybe just checking amino acids as follow-up. The organic acids are part of the Metabolomix profile. So in a similar way, if I'm seeing abnormals there in the Metabolomix, then I might follow up just with the organic acids. The metabolic analysis profile essentially is basically the part of the Metabolomix profile that's focused just on organic acids. So I think of those more as follow-ups, and the Metabolomix Plus as a great starting point because it casts a much wider net of things to look for nutritionally.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Sure.
No one else seems to have any questions. I guess I have all the questions. I was going to
That's
ask
okay.
another one. So what if patients ask, like if this is a fairly new test that a doctor is using in practice, and let's say a patient has had maybe blood tests done previously and looking at nutrient testing, what would you say to explain what's the difference between looking at nutrients in blood versus looking at nutrients in urine?
It's a good question. And it somewhat depends on the type of nutrient. For instance, red blood cell magnesium is a good way to look at magnesium levels. Gives you magnesium status over the life of the red blood cell, so that can be valid. But on the other hand, things like serum B12, not all that useful. And the reason why is because you're measuring B12 in the serum, which can be helpful for catching a severe deficiency of B12. But a subclinical need for B12, or someone who maybe not severely deficient, but deficient enough to have a contribution to a particular symptom, methylmalonic acid is going to be a better indicator of that. And the reason why is methylmalonic acid is something that happens in the cell, and it's more reflective of tissue levels of B12. Just because B12 is high in the serum, which I've seen that high in serum in patients who have a salad the day prior to the test. Their B12 levels are high, but yet they're B12 deficient because their homocysteine is high, or they're having neurological symptoms and they've had a gastric bypass or something where it's really hard for them to maintain B12 status. Serum B12s aren't, in my opinion, they don't tell me as much. They may be helpful for determining a severe deficiency, but methylmalonic acid, because that's a reaction in the cell that depends on B12, you get a much better sense of tissue levels of B12, in my opinion.
Thank you. I hope that's helpful to our listeners here. Any other questions, guys? If you can please type it in. I know you won't be able to hear you, but you can type them in if you have any questions. Or if you think of something after we close off the webinar, you can always send us an email and we will try to include those in the follow-up as well. I guess my last question for you, Dr. Brown, is with your patients, and because Genova has quite a lot of tests to offer, when would you opt for when will you opt for running a nutritional test versus a stool test if the patient is really only able to choose one or the other and cannot run both?
That's a great question. We get this all the time. And I don't think there's a wrong answer for this, but the way I think of it is if the patient has gut symptoms, I'm leaning a little bit more towards a stool test. If the patient says, I don't really have any gut problems. I feel like my digestion is fine. No gas, no bloating, no constipation, loose stools. If none of that is a problem, then I'll lean a little bit more towards something like a Metabolomix Plus or a NutrEval. So I look to gut symptoms to help make that decision. I realize that there can be gut dysfunction without symptoms. So that is something to consider. But generally speaking, I find that my patients are more willing to do a stool test when there are some gut symptoms, even if they're mild. I think a stool test like a GI Effects Comprehensive makes a lot more sense to them. This is just for my patient population. But I don't think there's a wrong answer. I think you could start with either one, a NutrEval Metabolomix or a GI Effects Comprehensive. They're often good starting points because they look at so many markers and so many different aspects of the patient's biochemistry.
Awesome. Thank you.
Sure.
So I don't see any more right now. So let's let people mull this over, and then we can always address questions as they come up afterwards. And when we send out our follow-up, we will do that. So we'll end off a little earlier than planned. Thank you very much, Dr. Brown, for your insight. And we will make sure that everyone has a copy of the webinar, as well as following up with some of the links to the Learn GDX, as well as the interpretive guide. I forgot to mention that you do have a really large, comprehensive nutritional interpretive guide as well that I read through, and it's definitely applicable to the Metabolomix, as is the NutrEval.
Thank you, Saroma. Thanks for having me. Thank you to all of the attendees. Thanks for taking your time to join us. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thanks. Take care. Bye.